If this is your first time listening to our podcast, welcome. Our programming brings a diversity of voices connected to Myanmar to share their perspectives, thoughts, and reflections about what has been happening there since the military coup in 2021. All of our guests share one thing in common: a deep personal stake in the ongoing crisis. And it is an honor for us to be able to bring their voices into your earbuds. But however difficult it may be to hear some of their stories, we hope that you will come away with a deeper and more nuanced understanding of what is happening there.
Continuing our theme of discussing the non-conflict elements of the ongoing Myanmar crisis, my guest today is from the Solidarity Center, here to discuss a damning report released by the International Labour Organization regarding the endemic abuses of laborers and labor rights in Myanmar. So, Jeffrey, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself and your organization for our listeners.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Jeff Vogt. I'm the legal director for the Solidarity Center and currently a member of the ILO governing body. The Solidarity Center is an international NGO that promotes the rights of workers and trade unions worldwide, and we've been working with workers and trade unions in Myanmar for several decades.
Excellent. Now, this report that was released, Towards Freedom and Dignity in Myanmar, is its title. There is a lot going on here, and let's just start with the convention. So, Convention number 87 and Convention number 29, both of these conventions are frequently cited in the report. You frequently point to violations of these two conventions. Can you explain to us what these conventions actually do?
Right. So the Convention 87 is the convention on the protection of the right to freedom of association and to organize, and Convention 29 on the prohibition on forced labor. These are two of the fundamental conventions of the ILO, and these are two conventions which Myanmar has ratified, which allows us to seek a commission of inquiry.
Well, I would say, like, with the 87, so the free assembly, what exactly does free assembly entail? What would qualify as a violation of that convention?
Right. So Convention 87 protects the rights of workers to form and join trade unions of their choosing, to write up their rules, their constitutions, and to undertake activity, including the right to strike. So this is, yeah.
So in effect, Convention 87 protects the right of workers to form trade unions and act to protect their workers' interests.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so let's start with that one then, because that is a topic that we have seen covered on this channel before. It'd be interesting to get an outsider perspective. How you say you've been tracking labor activity in Myanmar for some time. How have labor unions and their status within the state changed in the pre-coup and the post-coup realities of Myanmar?
Well, obviously for a very long time, their trade unions were non-existent for the most part, And it wasn't until 2011, 2012 that the government had passed laws regulating the formation of trade unions and laws regulating essentially collective bargaining and dispute settlement. And these two laws, though they had numerous defects, at least set the foundations for trade unions to be once again legal and to undertake their activities, though again with many limitations. So this led from that period forward, kind of a new springtime for trade unions in Myanmar, and we saw a number of trade unions take advantage of this space and register unions throughout the country. Um, Obviously, at the time of the coup, then that that nearly 10-year span of time was reversed almost immediately with the government declaring the dissolution of a number of unions, um, uh, you know, sending issuing warrants for the arrest of a number of trade union leaders. Um,
Did they have a
and
reason for those, by the way? Like, was there an official stated purpose, like, I don't know, treason or criminal activity, or did they just decide to get rid of them for no real reason?
Right. Well, we know that trade unions, among many other members of civil society, were part of the CDM, I believe, the movement against the coup, and the trade unions were among a large sector of civil society that was kind of well organized, obviously by its nature, and yeah, also had important links regionally and internationally. So I think they saw the trade unions as a particular risk, and moved quickly to try to minimize that by, again, deregistering many of the unions, arresting their leadership, um, sending others into exile, revoking the citizenship, in fact, of some leaders. And now at this point, I'd say freedom of associations all but impossible to exercise in any real meaningful way.
So then this leads to a very important question, which um, is what was the actual efficacy of trade unions? Because we've had a lot of circumstances, particularly in socialist and post-socialist states, where trade unions exist but are often just puppet organizations run by the government that don't really protect the rights of workers. So in this spring period of trade unions that you speak of, during the 2011 onwards uh, period, did we actually see trade unions effectively advocating for laborers? Did we actually see an improvement of labor conditions? Did we actually see effectiveness among those trade unions?
Yes, I mean it's you're coming from a history where there in fact had been no trade unions, right? So it's this isn't akin to a kind of post-Soviet transition where you're seeing state-led unions in a new environment struggling to find a purpose. This is now workers who had no effective representation uh, up until again the 2010 2011, and as a result of many factors, but the fact that they couldn't organize and bargain were making extraordinarily low wages and poor working conditions. Uh, so when there was the opportunity for workers to organize and they kind of knew of it, and then they recognized that there was safety in relatively in coming out and forming unions, that it wouldn't lead to state repression. then we saw thousands of workers throughout the country joining unions, and using those unions as a vehicle to make demands of their employers on wages and working conditions. So I think it was. I think the union movement in Myanmar uh, was making important progress.
Excellent. And so this is being utterly dismantled, as you say. I don't know whether you'd be able to speak on this in particular, but the general understanding that we receive from a lot of different experts is that many ostensibly private enterprises, non-nationalized enterprises, are in fact controlled directly by the military through various conglomerates and holding companies, MEC, MEHL notably. Would you be able to speak to whether this activity of shutting down trade unions, shutting down the progress of workers' rights, is restricted primarily to sectors that the military has financial interests in, or whether it just extends across the country?
I mean, I think it's a blanket prohibition. I mean, obviously there was significant organizing in the public sector over the last, the 10 years before the coup. We had teachers and civil servants and workers working for state-owned companies, but you also saw significant organizing in the private sector, um, including in kind of special economic zones, producing for export. So, to some major international brands. So, yeah, no, I think it's the organizing was happening throughout the economy of Myanmar, and that is effectively shut down across the board. But I think the only unions now you really see able to exist are those who are essentially employer or government dominated unions that are replacing those who are legitimately formed by the workers themselves.
So that basically we're seeing a rise of these false. I don't know whether there's a term of art for this, but unions that are basically just there to protect the rights of the owners of the industries rather than the workers themselves.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. And so beyond the actual erosion of unions themselves, have we seen the expected corollary erosion of the standard of labor, the workers' protections, the salaries, and all of these things?
Well, certainly we have workers unable at this point to be able to address workplace grievances or bargaining collectively over their terms and conditions of work. So that's certainly having an impact on workers throughout the country. I mean, obviously, the fact of the coup itself is having an economic impact on the country, which is also having an impact on employment and workers' wages and welfare. But the fact that they have no collective representation at this point makes it impossible for them to you know kind of redress that at a workplace level or at a national level, right? They have no effective collective voice at this point.
So that leads on to an interesting dynamic, because the most important factor, I would say, underlining all of this is whether or not you can fire someone and replace them, supply and demand. And so how much has the circumstance shifted? Because we understand that the ongoing conflict has led to a disastrous economy. Businesses don't seem to be doing as much as they were doing before. Salaries seem to have taken a dive, definitely in relation to the cost of living. And what's the relationship like between employers and employees, just in terms of pure basic market realities? Are the employers in an easier position to find new workers, or are the workers able to at least threaten their employers by saying, well, I'm going to walk out?
Well, I would suppose that the threat to walk at this point is a fairly weak one because with high unemployment, I think the chances of being able to find replacement workers is probably quite high. And given the economic situation, it wouldn't be unimaginable that workers in a dire situation uh, would accept work even under the wages and conditions that are being offered.
Fair enough. So let's then turn to the other convention. So convention number 29. You say this covers forced labor.
Mm.
Can you is there a definition of forced labor that the ILO uses?
Yes, Convention 29 itself has a definition, which I don't have right in front of me at the moment, but basically it's that um, forced labor happens when there is a worker service which the worker does not voluntarily offer, and for which there is a penalty for refusing to work. Um, there are books written describing that go into great detail on each of those elements, right? For purposes of this commission of inquiry, I mean, I can go into some detail about what are the specific cases, but I'd also mention for the listeners that this is not the first time that Myanmar has actually been under a commission of inquiry for forced labor. This was, yeah, and this fact is Myanmar is now the only country in the history of the ILO to have uh, been subject to two commissions of inquiry, and in this case, including on the same convention, on Convention 29. In the 1990s, uh, the Myanmar was brought to the ILO because of the military imposed work, including portering and construction of kind of military camps and forced recruitment of people into the military, including children, um, and also forcible work on kind of military owned projects, including the famous Unical pipeline. Right, so the commission of inquiry was established then, and established that there was forced labor, and it was not until actually the establishment of a quasi-civilian government that that commission of inquiry was closed, which I think was around 2014, 2015. And now we see, obviously, with the coup now in 2021, the reestablishment of forced labor for many of the same purposes. Again, used by the military in portering equipment, um, in you know clearing you know clearing roads, building camps. Yeah, in some cases, acting as human shields. Um, and what was interesting about this, and not an issue that came up so much in the last commission of inquiry, was also the allegations of forced overtime, which overtime in itself may not necessarily be tantamount to forced labor, but if it's uh, you know, more systemic, right, and that there are certain consequences that may come from the refusal of overtime, that itself also can be an indicator of forced labor, and that also goes into your previous question about freedom of association. If you don't have a union through which you can fight back against the employer, the forcible overtime is not surprising, right? Including to such a degree that it becomes forced labor.
So it's not it's not this clear black and white between you have regular mutually agreed upon employment and you get paid for that versus you get sent off to a forced labor camp. The forced labor can start off in a much more subtle way, is what you're saying.
Right. There's a spectrum of activity which can be forced labor. Yeah, I would say with forced overtime being one, and being forced to serve as a human shield on the other end.
Hmm. Okay, and so the report outlines multiple different elements of violations of this particular convention, and so you've just said this is the only country that has been subject to two such investigations.
Yes.
That's so I mean that sounds very significant. So the ILO has, I assume, basically jurisdiction over the whole world, right?
Well, those over countries that have that are members of the ILO, and also for commission of inquiry can only be undertaken into conventions that have been ratified by that country. So in this case, Myanmar has ratified both of those conventions, which allowed constitutionally a commission of inquiry to be established. It just a little bit more background. I mean, the to establish a commission of inquiry, um, the governing body of the ILO, and this is what happened in this case, has to take a decision to establish such a commission. The ILO, again, more background that may make this more helpful. The governing body, or the ILO itself, is a UN agency, but unique in the fact that its uh, governments only have half the seats in the governance structure. Unions have another quarter of the seats, and employers have another quarter of the seats. So together, you have this kind of co-governance between labor employers and the states. Um, so it was kind of a mutual agreement by the three parties to establish it based on the uh, the facts as they were occurring on the ground, and the fact that the ILO had issued previous resolutions on Myanmar after the coup, because of the very serious allegations that were coming from the ground.
So, just for context and background, does Myanmar itself have a seat on the ILO?
Uh, it does. I mean, it is as a member of the ILO, it is. Um, it obviously can attend the International Labor Conference and is a member. Whether it's so of all the member states, of which are about 180, a certain number of them on a rotating basis sit on the governing body.
Mm.
Uh, Myanmar is not a member of the governing body. Wasn't at the time, and it's obviously not now. And there is Myanmar has not been invited to participate in the conference since the coup because there's been a dispute among who represents the government of Myanmar. There's obviously the national unity government that is making a claim that it represents the state, and then you have the military regime that is claiming that it represents the state.
Mm.
So, given the conflicting claims on um, who represents the state, and no one has been allowed up to this point to represent the state at the ILO.
Okay. So interesting. So the ILO's internal structure does deviate from the United Nations General Assembly structure, which seems just to be based on incumbency principles. So ILO can actually move in and say, until this dispute is settled, no one gets it. No one gets the seat.
Well, I mean, it's the UN General Assembly also has a credentials process similar to the ILO. So I mean, you can have other situations in which there have been coups or other disruptions in governance, where you may have more than one party claiming to represent the state. So this is not unheard of. I mean, the thing that is making this a little bit more complicated is that the UN General Assembly is still recognizing in this kind of tacit agreement that the former ambassadors of the UN in New York for the NLD, although that is the so that's kind of left the UN General Assembly not to have to really address this decision. They've been just kind of treading water, not having to make a decision between the NUG and the military regime, because they're kind of allowing this former diplomat to keep the space. But at the ILO, that we don't have such a circumstance. So,
Interesting.
so it may be the case that the ILO takes it on its own initiative next year to make that decision for itself.
Okay, interesting. It's good to understand these contextual points because they can be very, very important down the line. So then, okay, so there's a certain degree to which these investigations have to be voluntary. Like a country actually has to be a signatory to the convention. So, with that in mind, would you say that the scale of what is going on in Myanmar with regards to labor violations is, in a global sense, exceptionally bad? Or is it just that the majority of countries that have endemic violations simply do not join the ILO or do not become signatories to the conventions?
Well, I would say the ILO has not universal, but nearly universal membership. So, I mean, there are a lot of both good and bad actors that are members of the ILO. And I believe Myanmar ratified many of these conventions quite some time ago. So no, it's not it's not so much that. But I think the with regard to the fundamental conventions such as these, the Convention 29 and 87, they're not universal ratification, but very high levels of ratification because they're seen as being, particularly important that all countries respect these conventions. So, yeah, you see a high degree of ratification.
Interesting. So that would then indicate that the Myanmar violation of labor laws is unusually bad.
Yes, I mean a commission of inquiry is not established in the first place unless there is a serious violation of a ratified convention. There are other mechanisms that can be used within the ILO system to raise complaints about non adherence. Commission of inquiry is only really reserved to those situations where there are very serious or serious concerns about non-adherence or non-compliance, and this is certainly one of those cases.
So for the audience's benefit, then it should be understood that the fact that the report has been published is not simply a matter of course. It's not a regular annual review that everybody would be subject to. It is itself quite a significant thing that the ILO would even go to the extent of launching the investigation in the first place.
Right. It's there have not been that many commission of inquiries in the 100-year history of the ILO, and again, it actually requires a political decision of the governing body to agree to establish a commission of inquiry based on the facts before it. So this was not in this case was not a difficult decision for the governing body. It had a broad support.
Okay, and so turning back to the evidence that's being presented, I think perhaps the most egregious, you have a section here entitled Work or Service as Porters, Guides, Human Shields, and for Camp Construction within the general topic of, labor extracted by the military in the context of armed conflict and military activities. So what can you tell us about this? Are you saying that the military themselves are going in, grabbing civilians, and forcing them to work for the military?
Yes, I mean, and this was again the basis of the previous commission of inquiry against Myanmar, and this one is similar. So they'll go into communities, villages, and in particular now where the government, or not the government, the military regime is in fighting a kind of ethnic militia, and will say, all right, we need 10 men to help clear this area, put up a camp, and maintain the camp. If you don't, we're going to assume that you're with a hostile militia, and some have been executed on the spot, right? So you really, you don't really have a choice, right? And the consequences for refusal are obviously can be extremely serious. So yeah, I mean that's what makes it forced labor. There's absolutely no choice as to whether to uh, offer your services in that sense.
I mean, that's horrific. Do we know like if these people do in fact comply and they do what the military tells them to do? Are they actually subsequently released, or do they just sort of get kept around as essentially slave labor?
My understanding is that these may be periods of forced labor for a period of time until the military moves on, or they have no longer use for that service. So no, I don't think there's a traveling or mobile forced labor force. I think as military is moving into an area, they will force civilians in that location to do what they need so long as the military is there. I mean, there are some cases, obviously, in the case of portering, where somebody who may need to move from one area to another because they're carrying military equipment, or again, in the case of human shields, you're marching with the military, essentially to catch bullets for the military.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So I'm going to quote from the report here, pages 151 and 152. There are reports that in Shan and Kayah states between November 2021 and February 2022, civilians, including at least 80 children from Chinpon village in Sagaing, were detained by the military for 36 hours as potential human shields during clashes with resistance groups. Can you talk about this human shield thing? Because it's a phrase that we hear a lot. But what does that actually look like? What is the idea here with seizing 80 children from a village?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way it's manifested in this case is that if a military is marching in a formation, they may have civilians, surrounding the military in front or in back of it. For example, as they're moving from one area to another through through territory where they believe they may come under fire, with the expectation then that the civilians who are acting as human shields are going to be the first to be shot, and thus giving the military time to take cover and I guess return fire. So yeah, that's how human shields are being used in this circumstance.
Do we actually have any information on whether or not these human shields have been killed as a result?
I believe the report, this report or others, do have indicated that people have died as a result.
Wow. And so this is not what I expected to see in a labor report. Like this, last time I read the Geneva Conventions, human shields were a war crime, doubly so when you're using children. Is this something that the ILO is forwarding on to other organizations within the UN or the international community generally?
Yeah, so it is a UN record, and I think as other UN agencies are taking up the supervision of Myanmar under its various international human rights obligations, this will obviously be cited. But I think you're right. Absolutely, in my view, the report clearly outlines crimes against humanity and in war crimes in the context of uh, forced labor. I mean, so I mean the ILO has a specific mandate, um, which is obviously the world of labor, and is able to make certain determinations based on the scope of the conventions that has uh, as the basis of its supervision. So it is able to indicate, as this report does, that something the facts indicate serious violations of the prohibition on forced labor. The ILO itself does not have a mandate to identify something as a crime against humanity as a war crime, though I think in this case they clearly are. So that would be for other UN agencies to make that determination, or for others to bring uh, to bring such a claim um, at other relevant tribunals in the UN system.
And I mean, this, just reading this report, and again, for those in the audience who are looking for it, it's called Towards Freedom and Dignity in Myanmar. Chapter 7, particularly the part focusing on the violations of forced labor, this reads like a horror story. That this is not just forced labor, which in and of itself is terrible, but this is the report seems to indicate that it is absolutely commonplace and routine for the military to go anywhere and to use civilians, use civilian homes, use civilian vehicles, civilian property to their own ends, and in a lot of cases, perfidiously. You specifically highlight that the military will demand that people come and guide them, give them sort of guidance through rough terrain, even though the military knows that terrain very well. They're being duplicitous, and they're saying that we need assistance in trekking across this terrain, when really they're just hoping that those guides are going to be the first ones to get shot. Like this is very shocking and appalling to read. So the next question, and I'm sure the answer is going to be disappointing, but it has to be asked: what next steps can actually be taken? Is there any way to try and rectify these offenses?
Well, yes. I mean, it's so fortunately, outside the ILO, we already know that a number of governments have already issued a number of sanctions on the government, whether they're financial sanctions, trade sanctions, visa sanctions. There's a range of activities that's already taken. Whether more can be done, obviously, is an open question, right? And I think certainly there could be within the scope of the ILO. There is the possibility that the governing body could decide to refer this issue to the conference, which is the kind of the plenary of the ILO. It's where every once a year, all of the member states plus unions and employers from around the world will meet. It's more kind of the legislature of the ILO, and this matter could be referred to the conference for them to take up this matter under Article 33 of the Constitution. Article 33 has only been invoked twice in the history of the ILO. The first time it was done was the last time that Myanmar was under a commission of inquiry, and then just the year before against Belarus. So Myanmar could be now the first country to ever have two applications of Article 33. And Article 33 of the ILO Constitution basically just says if you invoke this, you're calling on all member states of the ILO to take measures to try to bring Myanmar into compliance with its obligations under the conventions. That can have a lot of meanings, right? It's on the institution itself to try to take what steps it can to uh, pressure the government. It also is a signal to other UN organizations, international financial institutions, and other member states, as well as unions and employers, to take measures um, to try to compel the government to respect these conventions. And that can take a lot of forms. And some of the ways in which we're talking have already taken place because of sanctions that have been imposed since the 2021 coup. But it will put a broad pressure on all member states and other intergovernmental institutions to step it up and find ways to, further pressure the government to comply. It will make it obviously more difficult for uh, companies to invest or do business in Myanmar, especially those that have any sort of human rights due diligence obligations. So, I mean, it will make it. It may lose certain trade preferences as a result. I mean, so there are a number of um, uh, consequences that may come from a result of the well, the Commission of Inquiry being established for one, and Article 33 would be really uh, you know
Yeah.
the the fullest expression of the ILO membership that this the facts here are just so far beyond the pale that more full and complete measures need to be taken to address the situation.
Because then this is something that we've dealt with for a long time. The lack of appropriate sanctioning has been a thorn in the side of the revolution. A particularly salient example that comes to mind was that even after the United States put through the Burma Bill, they put through a lengthy section on Burma in the National Defense Authorization Act.
Yeah.
Consistently, we saw exceptions being carved out for things like Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, because at the time Chevron still had people connected to them. So large corporate interests seem to have, and government interests seem to have prevented a lot of the really powerful, really impactful types of sanctions from being imposed, which is not to say that sanctions have not been imposed so far. They have been, and they have been quite impactful, and they have significantly reduced the junta's income. But the really big stuff, putting nationwide embargoes, things, for example, like jet fuel, these have eluded the revolutionary forces for years now. If Article 33 were to be triggered, do you anticipate that it genuinely would start leading to very broad spectrum, very powerful sanctions coming from economically significant countries?
Article 33 wouldn't require that. And again, many of these measures took place even before the Commission of Inquiry was established. So I think a number of countries, in particular, because of the previous military period, had not or didn't wait this time, right? Because I think they recognized um, that there was a high likelihood of the repetition of human rights abuses that happened under the previous military period were likely to resurface again, and have, right. So um, I think that explains kind of the quicker reaction time this time around. But no, there's nothing about Article 33 is going to immediately lead to restrictions on jet fuel or further sanctions on Myanmar oil and gas. Although it will certainly, I think, give civil society in Myanmar and outside further argumentation as to why those gaps in the sanctions regimes need to be closed.
Mm. And just for context, how many times has an Article 33 been triggered in the past?
Only twice, again, in the over 100-year history of the ILO, Myanmar
Wow.
being the first, and Belarus only having the second Article 33. That was last year. So it's an extraordinarily rarely used measure, and again, it would be exceptional in that a country would have that applied to them twice.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, it's quite difficult to. I mean, the number of countries that we think of as bad actors and serial violators of workers' rights and labor unions, and yet Myanmar would be the first country to receive two Article 33s, and only the second country in history to have one at all. It really sort of underscores just how severe and abusive the violations are under the current regime.
Yes.
But yeah, so essentially, what you're saying though is that the ILO itself doesn't actually have any direct authority. What the ILO is really only able to do is to call upon others to choose to take action.
Yeah, I mean, it actually is in some sense, is a coordinating body, and is also able to, interact with other intergovernmental organizations on the same issue, right? So it would be on the ILO would very likely, in the case of an Article 33. Well, the scope of to clarify, the scope of the actions to be taken on Article 33 would also be determined by the governing body. So the governing body would then outline a set of recommended actions which could be taken, and then it would be up for the conference as a whole to then decide whether to amend that list or to vote on it as is or amended. In the earliest that could happen would be June of 2024.
Okay, so that's not too far away. That gives us a reasonable timeline to anticipate something to be done. Excellent. So, yeah, looking at the report that's written here, obviously there are a number of recommendations, but many of these recommendations are likely to fall on deaf ears on the Myanmar side, calling for the respect for these conventions. I mean, we've seen how little regard the Myanmar military has for ASEAN requests and for the United Nations in general. So hopefully something more substantial can come down the pipeline.
I mean, if I was kind of make one observation, I guess I would start it this way. Just say I think as the report reflects, the ability of workers to be able to associate and collectively form trade unions is absolutely important. And it's not only important because of the role of workers in advocating for members of their workplace, but the role of workers in their unions in being, proponents for democracy, both in the workplace and in their communities and society. And I think that is the reason why we saw the military regime acting quickly to crackdown on trade unions because they recognize, as other governments around the world have recognized in the past, that organized labor has played very important roles in the promotion of democracy in their countries, and that this government, this regime, rather, is not acted decisively to try to remove that threat. And I think this again just underscores the importance of kind of an organized civil society and organized workers in democracy. And I mean, that is also why we need to support workers, support the principle of freedom of association, because fundamentally it's about questions of democracy, whether it's democracy in the workplace, in your community, or in your country.
We want to take a moment to introduce you to our nonprofit Better Burma's online shop, which features handicrafts sourced from artisan communities scattered throughout Myanmar. Far from being mass-produced knockoffs, the pieces we offer are unique and handmade, reflecting the wide diversity of different peoples found throughout the country. When Myanmar experienced its transition period, moving from democracy in the late 2010s after decades of harsh military dictatorship, many Burmese craftspeople hoped their beautiful work could finally be appreciated beyond the country. When Myanmar experienced its transition period, moving towards democracy in the late 2010s after decades of harsh military dictatorship, many Burmese craftspeople hoped their beautiful work could finally be appreciated beyond the country's borders. But sadly, this was not to be so. Following the military coup, many skilled artisans suddenly found all possibility of continuing their livelihood closed off and began struggling just to feed their families. With this in mind, we prioritize working with artisans from disadvantaged and vulnerable backgrounds because we know just how hard it can be to survive at the margins of society in Myanmar. This includes such people as those with disabilities, mothers who have contracted HIV/AIDS, civil servants on CDM, ethnic and religious minorities, and more. To view these wonderful pieces, please visit alokacrafts.com. That's Aloka, A-L-O-K-A, crafts, C-R-A-F-T-S, one word, alokacrafts.com. Otherwise, please consider a donation through our usual channels. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Whatabaya Nangaya Unyana Daduya Danandri Ganizadamana, we got a Besayana, Besayo. Oba Yarananda Dayananga, Yaranaya, Dayanamboda, Yaranam.